Mark Ellison knelt on cold tile and lifted sapphire starlight from beneath a broken locker, unaware he was holding someone's entire past. Chicago's winter pressed against the windows as he turned the bracelet over in his calloused hands. Its clasp, engraved with a name he'd forgotten, was his own. By morning, a billionaire would stand before him trembling, and a young woman would whisper the words that would shatter 42 years of his quiet, invisible life. The bracelet was never lost. It was waiting, and now Mark must decide whether truth is worth the ruin it brings, or if some secret should remain buried beneath the shine. Subscribe to witness the unraveling. The hallway stretched long and dim, fluorescent lights buzzing their tired hymn above Mark Ellison's head as he pushed the industrial mop across linoleum that had seen better decades. His shoulders ached the way they always did after 8 hours of bending, scrubbing, emptying trash bins, overflowing with the careless refuse of people who never looked him in the eye. The high school in downtown Chicago smelled of disinfectant and adolescent sweat, of forgotten lunches rotting in lockers and chalk dust settling on desks no one bothered to wipe clean. Mark had worked here for nearly 5 years, arriving before dawn and leaving after sunset, invisible to teachers who rushed past him with coffee cups and students who laughed in clusters, their voices echoing off walls he'd scrubbed 1,000 times. He didn't mind the solitude, the quiet rhythm of his work, the way the building emptied and left him alone with his thoughts, and the hum of machinery that kept the lights on and the floors clean enough for another day of indifference. He paused near the athletic wing, where the lockers stood in rusted rows like soldiers who'd long since given up the fight. One locker hung open, its door bent at an angle that suggested violence or carelessness, and Mark sighed, setting his mop bucket down with a slosh of dirty water. He'd been meaning to report it to maintenance, but maintenance never came quickly, and the school board had slashed budgets again, leaving men like him to patch what they could with duct tape and hope. He crouched beside the locker, his knees protesting the motion, and peered inside at the usual debris: crumpled papers, a single sneaker with no lace, a textbook spine broken and forgotten. But then something caught the light, a glimmer beneath the torn poster of some forgotten band, and Mark reached in, his fingers brushing cold metal. He pulled it free and stared, breath catching in his throat. A bracelet, delicate and impossibly beautiful, lay in his palm, sapphires set in silver that seemed to hold the night sky within each stone, the clasp intricate and unbroken despite its abandonment. Mark turned it over slowly, his rough hands incongruous against its elegance. He'd seen jewelry before, cheap costume pieces left behind by careless teenagers, but this was different. This was real. The weight of it, the way the light danced across the facets, told him it belonged to someone who didn't lose things lightly. He stood, holding it up to the flickering fluorescent glow, and wondered who could have left it here, in this place where nothing precious ever lingered. The school served working families, kids whose parents juggled 2 jobs and food stamps, whose lockers held hand-me-down textbooks and lunches packed in reused grocery bags. A bracelet like this didn't belong here, not in this hallway where the paint peeled and the ceiling tiles sagged with water damage, yet here it was, shimmering in his hand, like a piece of another world had fallen through a crack and landed at his feet. Mark felt a strange pull in his chest, a sense that finding this object was more than coincidence, though he couldn't name why. He slipped the bracelet into his pocket and finished his shift, his mind circling back to it again and again as he mopped the cafeteria and locked the supply closet. By the time he clocked out, the sky outside had turned the bruised purple of Chicago winter dusk, streetlights flickering on against the cold. Mark walked to the administrative office, where the night secretary glanced up from her computer with tired eyes that barely registered his presence. He pulled the bracelet from his pocket and laid it on her desk, explaining where he'd found it, how it had been hidden beneath torn paper and rust. She blinked, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, and then she picked it up, holding it to the light the same way he had. For a moment, something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe recognition. But she said nothing, only nodded and told him she'd log it in the lost and found, that someone would claim it or it would sit in a box with forgotten gym clothes and single gloves until the end of the semester. Mark thanked her and left, pulling his coat tight against the wind that cut through the streets like a blade. He walked home through neighborhoods he knew by heart, past bodegas with barred windows and bus stops where people huddled against the cold, their faces illuminated by phone screens. His apartment was small, a studio on the third floor of a building that smelled of cooking oil and mildew, but it was his, paid for with the paychecks he never missed, and the overtime he always accepted. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the radiator hissing its uneven warmth, and he made himself a simple dinner. Canned soup heated on the stove. Bread toasted in a pan because the toaster had broken months ago, and he hadn't replaced it. As he ate, he thought about the bracelet, about the way it had felt in his hand, both foreign and strangely familiar. He wondered if anyone would come for it. If someone was searching frantically, retracing steps and calling friends, desperate to find what they'd lost. Or if it had been discarded, tossed aside like so many things people no longer wanted, left for someone like him to find and return to the indifferent machinery of lost and found. That night, Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the city sounds filtering through thin walls. Sirens in the distance, footsteps on the stairs, the muffled argument of neighbors he'd never met. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams he couldn't quite remember, fragments of voices and places that slipped away the moment he woke. But beneath it all, there was a feeling, a whisper of something waiting just beyond his understanding, as though the bracelet had opened a door he hadn't known existed. Morning would come soon, and with it, a man in a tailored suit standing in the hallway where Mark had mopped away the grime of other people's lives. The billionaire would arrive like a storm, and Mark Ellison, who had spent 42 years being no one to anyone, would suddenly become the center of a story he never asked to be part of. But for now, he slept, unaware that the sapphire bracelet gleaming beneath the broken locker had already set in motion a reckoning that would upend everything he thought he knew about himself. Mark arrived at the school before sunrise, the way he always did, his breath misting in the frozen air as he unlocked the service entrance and stepped into the familiar darkness of empty hallways. The building settled around him with its usual creaks and groans, the heating system kicking on with a metallic shudder, and he moved through his routine with the ease of repetition, unlocking supply closets, setting out mops and buckets, checking the bathrooms for vandalism or leaks. The morning light crept through high windows in pale strips, casting long shadows across the lockers, and Mark worked in silence, his mind still circling back to the bracelet he'd turned in the night before. He wondered if anyone had claimed it yet, if the secretary had logged it properly, if it was already sitting in some plastic bin waiting to be forgotten. But the thought felt incomplete, as though the bracelet story hadn't ended with his finding it, and that unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. He was halfway through mopping the main corridor when he heard voices, sharp, insistent, echoing off the walls in a way that didn't belong to the usual morning rush of teachers and students. Mark paused, leaning on his mop, and listened. Two voices, one female and clipped with administrative authority, the other male and resonant with the kind of command that didn't expect to be questioned. The secretary appeared first, rounding the corner with quick steps, her face drawn tight with something between anxiety and confusion. Behind her walked a man who didn't belong here, not in this building with its peeling paint and flickering lights, not in this neighborhood where wealth was measured in making rent on time. He was tall, late 50s, his silver hair swept back in a way that suggested expensive salons and personal stylists, his suit tailored to perfection, charcoal grey with a sheen that caught the light. His shoes clicked against the linoleum with the precision of someone who never had to watch where he stepped. And his eyes, sharp, pale blue, calculating, swept the hallway as though cataloguing every flaw, every crack in the facade. The secretary spotted Mark and gestured toward him, her voice tight. "That's him! That's the janitor who found it!" The man's gaze swung to Mark, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. The janitor in his worn uniform, mop in hand, and the billionaire in his immaculate suit, standing like a statue carved from marble and ambition. Mark felt something cold settle in his chest, a premonition he couldn't articulate, and he set the mop against the wall, wiping his hands on his pants as the man approached. Up close, the stranger was even more imposing, his presence filling the hallway with an energy that felt both magnetic and oppressive. He stopped a few feet from Mark, his expression unreadable, and when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, every word measured. "You're Mark Ellison." It wasn't a question. Mark nodded, his throat suddenly dry, and the man extended a hand. "Adrian Voss." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, and Mark's mind raced, trying to place it, to understand why it felt significant. Adrian Voss. The name belonged to headlines Mark had glimpsed on newspaper stands he passed but never stopped to read, to billboards advertising tech companies Mark couldn't afford to care about. Adrian Voss, founder of Voss Innovations, a tech empire that spanned continents, whose wealth was the kind that built skylines and bought politicians. Mark shook his hand, the grip firm and cold, and Adrian's eyes never left his face, studying him the way a scientist might study a specimen under glass. "I understand you found a bracelet," Adrian said, his voice steady but laced with something Mark couldn't identify. Urgency, perhaps, or desperation hidden beneath layers of control. Mark nodded again, his mind struggling to catch up, to understand why a man like Adrian Voss would be standing in a Chicago public school hallway at dawn, asking about a piece of jewelry Mark had found beneath a broken locker. "I turned it in last night," Mark said, his voice quieter than he intended. "To the office. They said they'd put it in lost and found." Adrian's jaw tightened, the only visible crack in his composure. "The bracelet belongs to my daughter," he said, and the words carried a weight that pressed down on Mark's chest. "It's been missing for 3 years." 3 years. Mark's breath caught, his mind reeling. He thought of the bracelet, the way it had shimmered in his hand, impossibly pristine despite being wedged beneath locker debris. 3 years was long enough for things to corrode, to gather dust, to be forgotten by everyone except the person who'd lost them. But the bracelet had looked untouched, as though it had been placed there recently, deliberately. Adrian continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, as though he were sharing a secret he hadn't meant to. "My daughter Lila disappeared 3 years ago. She left everything behind, her apartment, her accounts, her entire life. The bracelet was the last thing I gave her before she vanished. And now you've found it here, in a place she had no reason to be." Mark felt the hallway tilt slightly, the fluorescent lights above him buzzing louder, the walls pressing in. He didn't know what to say, how to respond to the grief buried beneath Adrian Voss's controlled exterior. The man was a billionaire, untouchable, yet here he stood, speaking of loss, with the same rawness Mark had felt when his own mother passed years ago, leaving him alone in the world with nothing but her faded photographs and the quiet ache of absence. Adrian's eyes searched Mark's face, as though looking for something, recognition, guilt, answers Mark didn't have. "I need to know where you found it," Adrian said, his voice sharper now, edged with demand. "Exactly where, every detail." Mark swallowed, his mouth dry, and he gestured toward the athletic wing, his hand trembling slightly. "A locker, near the gym. It was under some trash, hidden. I almost didn't see it. Adrian turned, his gaze following Mark's gesture, and for a moment he looked smaller, as though the vastness of the hallway had swallowed him whole. Then Adrian turned back, and his expression had shifted, hardened into something more dangerous. "I need you to come with me," he said, and it wasn't a request. Mark hesitated, his instinct screaming at him to refuse, to stay in the safe, predictable rhythm of his life, but something in Adrian's eyes held him. Pain, yes, but also a determination that suggested refusal wouldn't change the outcome. Adrian Voss was a man who got what he wanted, and right now, what he wanted was Mark. "I have work," Mark said weakly, gesturing to the mop, the bucket, the hallway still half-cleaned. Adrian reached into his jacket and pulled out a wallet, extracting a card he handed to the secretary. "Whatever his salary is, I'll cover it. And more. He's coming with me." The secretary took the card, her eyes widening, and Mark felt his world narrowing, the edges of his reality fraying as Adrian Voss's presence consumed everything else. Within minutes, Mark found himself in the back of a black car that smelled of leather and wealth, the city blurring past the tinted windows as Adrian sat across from him, silent and coiled like a spring about to snap. And Mark, who had wanted nothing more than to live his quiet, invisible life, felt the weight of something immense settling on his shoulders, a story he didn't understand, a past he couldn't remember, and a bracelet that connected him to people whose pain was about to become his own. The car glided through Chicago streets with a silence that felt unnatural, as though the world outside had been muted by the tinted glass and the sheer force of Adrian Voss's will. Mark sat rigid in the leather seat, his hands folded in his lap, aware of every breath, every shift of his body against the expensive upholstery. Adrian stared out the window, his jaw set, his eyes distant, and the space between them filled with questions Mark didn't dare ask. The city changed as they drove, the familiar grit and grime of Mark's neighborhood giving way to streets lined with boutiques and cafes, glass towers that scraped the sky, sidewalks where people in tailored coats walked with purpose and expensive coffee cups. Mark had cleaned buildings like these, scrubbed the lobbies and polished the brass, but he'd never entered them through the front door, never ridden an elevator to the upper floors, where decisions were made and fortunes were built. Now, as the car pulled up to a sleek high-rise that seemed to pierce the clouds, Mark felt a disorienting vertigo, as though he'd stepped into a world that existed parallel to his own, but never touched it. Adrian led him through a lobby of marble and steel, past a security desk where guards nodded deferentially, into an elevator that rose so smoothly Mark's stomach didn't register the ascent. The doors opened onto a penthouse that defied comprehension, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that looked more like art than something meant to be sat on, a silence so profound Mark could hear his own heartbeat. Adrian gestured for him to sit, and Mark lowered himself onto a chair that felt too pristine for his presence, his janitor's uniform a stain on the perfection around him. Adrian disappeared into another room, leaving Mark alone with the view, the city sprawling beneath him like a map of lives he'd never live, dreams he'd never dream. He felt small here, inconsequential, a man made of cheap fabric and calloused hands in a world built for people who never worried about rent or broken toasters. When Adrian returned, he wasn't alone. A young woman followed him, her steps hesitant, her arms wrapped around herself as though holding herself together. She was 24, Mark guessed, though her eyes held an exhaustion that aged her beyond her years. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her face, framing features that might have been beautiful if they weren't so drawn, so haunted. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, but they hung on her frame as though she'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose, as though her body had become something she inhabited rather than owned. Adrian gestured toward her, his voice softer now, almost tender. "This is Lila." My daughter." Lila's gaze flickered to Mark, and for a moment their eyes met, and Mark saw something in hers that made his chest tighten. Fear, recognition, a plea for something he didn't understand. She looked away quickly, her hands trembling as she clasped them together, and Adrian moved to stand beside her, his presence both protective and oppressive. Lila's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper, fragile as glass. "You found my bracelet." Mark nodded, his throat tight, unsure what else to do. "I didn't know it was yours," he said, his voice rough, inadequate. "I just found it in a locker. I turned it in." Lila's lips pressed together, her eyes filling with something that might have been tears, but didn't fall. "I left it there," she said, the words slow, deliberate, as though each one cost her something. 3 years ago, I left it there and I walked away, and I thought that would be the end of it." Adrian's hand moved to her shoulder, a gesture meant to comfort, but that seemed to weigh her down instead. "Lila came back to Chicago 2 weeks ago," Adrian said, his voice strained. "She wouldn't tell me why, wouldn't tell me where she'd been, but she said she needed to find something she'd lost. I didn't know she meant the bracelet. I didn't know she'd hidden it in a school." Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together fragments that didn't fit. Why would someone like Lila Voss, daughter of a billionaire, hide a bracelet in a public school locker? Why would she leave it there for 3 years and then come back, desperate to reclaim it? And why did Adrian look at him with such intensity, as though Mark held answers he didn't know he possessed? Lila took a shaky breath, her gaze returning to Mark, and this time she held it, her eyes searching his face the way her father had earlier. "Do you remember me?" she asked, and the question landed like a blow, unexpected and disorienting. Mark frowned, his heart hammering. "No," he said slowly. "I don't think we've met." Lila's expression crumpled just slightly, a crack in the fragile composure she'd been holding. "We have," she whispered. 3 years ago, you were there that night. You helped me." Mark felt the room spin, the edges of his vision blurring. He shook his head, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. I don't remember. I don't know what you're talking about." But even as he spoke, something stirred in the back of his mind. A shadow of a memory he couldn't grasp, slipping away every time he reached for it. Lila stepped closer, her voice urgent now, desperate. "It was winter, late, after midnight. I was running. I didn't know where to go, and you found me near the school. You didn't ask questions, you helped. You gave me your jacket. You told me I could hide there in the locker room until morning. You said no one would find me." Mark's breath came faster, his mind clawing at the fog that obscured that night, that entire period of his life 3 years ago, when he'd been working double shifts, exhausted and numb, moving through days that blurred into one another. Adrian's voice cut through, sharp and commanding. "She said you gave her the bracelet, that you told her to keep it safe, that it would protect her." Mark's head snapped up, his confusion deepening into something close to panic. I wouldn't have. I've never seen that bracelet before yesterday." But Lila was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out a small photograph, crumpled and worn. She held it out to Mark, her hand shaking, and he took it, staring down at the image. It showed a younger Lila, her face bright with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, standing beside a man Mark didn't recognize. Except the man was him, older, thinner, but unmistakably him. And around Lila's wrist in the photograph was the sapphire bracelet, its stones catching the light just as they had when Mark pulled it from beneath the locker the day before. He stared at the photo, his mind fracturing, unable to reconcile the image with the blankness of his memory. And when he looked up, both Lila and Adrian were watching him, waiting for him to remember something he couldn't, to explain something he didn't understand. And Mark realized, with a cold certainty that settled in his bones, that the bracelet hadn't just connected him to these people. It had bound him to a night he'd erased from his own mind, a night that held secrets capable of destroying them all. Mark sat frozen, the photograph trembling in his hands. The image of himself standing beside Lila Voss 3 years ago, a tangible thing that should have sparked recognition, but instead only deepened the void in his memory. He looked up at Lila, her tear-streaked face waiting for something he couldn't give, and then at Adrian, whose expression had hardened into something unreadable, a mask of control barely concealing the storm beneath. Mark's throat felt tight, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "I don't remember this. I don't remember any of it." The words sounded hollow even to him, inadequate against the weight of the evidence in his hand, the photograph that placed him in a moment he'd somehow lost, a night erased from his mind as though it had never existed. Lila sank onto the edge of the couch, her hands pressed to her face, and Adrian moved to the window, his back to them both, his shoulders rigid as he stared out at the city below. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Adrian spoke, his voice low and edged with something dangerous. "The bracelet," Adrian said, still facing the window, "was custom-made. My wife designed it before she passed. Lila was 10 when I gave it to her. She wore it every day until she didn't." He turned then, his pale eyes locking onto Mark with an intensity that made Mark want to shrink into the chair. "Inside the clasp, there's an engraving. My wife insisted on it. A single word, something private, something only Lila and I knew." Adrian crossed the room in 3 long strides, pulling the bracelet from his pocket. Mark hadn't even realized he'd retrieved it from the school and held it out, his hand steady despite the emotion flickering across his face. "Look at it," Adrian commanded, his voice sharp. "Look at the clasp." Mark took the bracelet with numb fingers, the weight of it familiar now, though he still couldn't place why. He turned it over, squinting at the delicate silver clasp, and there, etched in tiny letters almost too small to read, was a name. Mark. His heart stopped. The room tilted. He stared at the engraving, his mind refusing to process what his eyes saw, the impossible truth that his name, was carved into a piece of jewelry that belonged to a billionaire's daughter, a bracelet she'd worn every day until she vanished. Mark's hands shook, and he looked up at Adrian, then at Lila, searching for an explanation, for anything that made sense. This can't," he stammered, his voice breaking. Lila wiped her eyes, her voice trembling but determined. "You told me to have it engraved," she said, her words slow and deliberate, as though pulling them from a deep well of memory. "That night, you said if I was going to keep it, I needed to remember who gave it to me. You said your name, and I took it to a jeweler the next day before I left Chicago. I had them engrave it because I didn't want to forget you." Adrian's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. "Lila never told me she'd changed the engraving," he said, his voice strained. "I thought it still said her mother's name. When she disappeared, I assumed she'd taken the bracelet with her. I searched for it, for her, for 3 years. And now you—" He gestured at Mark, his hand shaking slightly. "You show up with it, claiming you found it in a school locker, and my daughter insists you're the reason she survived that night." Mark felt his chest constrict, panic rising in his throat. "I don't know what happened," he said, his voice rising. "I don't remember. I work nights. I've been working nights for years, and 3 years ago I was exhausted. I was barely keeping it together, but I would never—" He stopped, his mind catching on something, a fragment of sensation rather than memory, the faint echo of cold wind, and a girl's voice, desperate and afraid. Adrian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "What do you remember?" he demanded. "Anything, even a fragment. This is my daughter's life we're talking about." Mark closed his eyes, pressing his palms against his temples, trying to force the memory to surface. He thought back to 3 years ago, to winter nights when he'd finished his shifts at the school and walked home through streets so cold his breath froze in the air. There had been a night. He couldn't pin down when, couldn't see it clearly, but there had been a moment when he'd found someone huddled near the school entrance, shivering and alone. He remembered the instinct to help, the way he always stopped when he saw someone in trouble, even though he had nothing to give. He remembered giving someone his jacket, telling them they could wait in the building until it was safe to leave. But the face was gone, the details swallowed by the exhaustion that had defined that period of his life, by the way he'd moved through his days on autopilot, too tired to form lasting memories. "I think," Mark began, his voice faltering, "I think I remember helping someone. A girl. But I didn't know who she was. I didn't ask. I let her stay until morning." Lila let out a choked sob, her hands covering her mouth. "You saved me," she whispered. "I was running from something I can't tell you about. And you didn't question it. You just let me hide." Adrian's expression shifted, the hardness cracking to reveal something raw beneath. "Why the bracelet?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "Why did you give her the bracelet?" Mark shook his head, helpless. "I didn't. I don't think I did. I don't—" But Lila interrupted, her voice stronger now, cutting through his confusion. "You didn't give it to me," she said. "I gave it to you. I told you it was all I had, that I wanted you to keep it in case something happened to me. You refused. You said you'd hold on to it until I came back for it. You hid it in the locker, and you told me where to find it if I ever needed it." The words settled over Mark like a shroud, pieces of a puzzle he didn't know he'd been part of arranging. He stared at the bracelet in his hands, at his name engraved in silver, and felt the weight of something massive pressing down on him, a responsibility he'd never asked for, but that had somehow become his. Adrian moved to stand beside Lila, his hand resting on her shoulder again, and when he spoke, his voice was laced with barely controlled fury. "If you helped her, if you were part of what happened that night, then you know why she ran, and if you know, then you're going to tell me. Because whatever she's running from, whatever secret she's protecting, it's connected to me, to my company, and I need to know what it is before it destroys everything I've built." Mark looked up at Adrian, at the man whose empire loomed over the city like a monument to power and ambition, and he realized with a sinking dread that he was no longer invisible, no longer just a janitor who cleaned floors and emptied trash. He was a thread in a tapestry he didn't understand, and pulling on it would unravel something vast and terrible, and the truth, whatever it was, would force him to choose between protecting Lila's freedom and exposing the secret that could bring Adrian Voss and his dynasty crashing down. Adrian Voss led Mark into a study that felt more like a vault, lined with dark wood and leather-bound books that had likely never been read, a space designed to intimidate and impress. Lila followed, her steps quiet, her presence a fragile thing that seemed out of place in the oppressive grandeur of her father's penthouse. Adrian gestured for Mark to sit, and Mark lowered himself into a chair that felt too stiff, too formal, his janitor's uniform a glaring contrast to the polished surfaces around him. Adrian poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, the amber liquid catching the light, and he drank it in one smooth motion before turning to face Mark and Lila, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Tell me everything," Adrian said, his voice firm but laced with an undercurrent of desperation. "From the beginning. What happened that night?" Lila looked at Mark, her eyes pleading, and Mark felt the weight of her gaze like a physical thing, pressing him to remember something he still couldn't fully grasp. Mark took a shaky breath, closing his eyes, and let his mind drift back to that winter 3 years ago, to the nights when he'd worked double shifts to make rent, when sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford. He remembered the cold, the way it seeped through his coat and settled in his bones, the way his hands went numb, even in his gloves. He remembered finishing his shift one night, later than usual, the school empty and dark, except for the emergency lights that cast long shadows down the hallways. He'd stepped outside into the frozen air, locking the door behind him, and that's when he'd heard it, a sound like a sob, choked and desperate, coming from the side of the building. He'd hesitated, exhausted and wanting nothing more than to go home, but something had pulled him toward the sound, some instinct he couldn't ignore. And there, huddled against the brick wall, was a girl, her face hidden by her hands, her body shaking with cold and fear. Mark opened his eyes, the memory sharpening now, pieces falling into place. "You were wearing a coat," he said, his voice directed at Lila, "but it wasn't warm enough. You were freezing, and you wouldn't look at me. You kept saying you couldn't go back, that you couldn't let them find you." Lila nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I'd just left," she whispered. "I just walked out of my father's office after I found something I wasn't supposed to see. And I knew if I stayed, if I tried to confront him, I'd never leave, so I ran." Adrian's face darkened, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing, letting her continue. "I didn't know where to go," Lila said, her voice trembling. "I just walked, and I ended up at that school, and I was so cold, and I thought I'd just sit there until I figured out what to do. And then you came out." Mark remembered now, the way the girl had looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, the way she'd flinched when he'd reached out to help. He'd taken off his coat, the only one he owned, and draped it over her shoulders, and she'd clutched it like a lifeline. He'd asked if she needed help, if she wanted him to call someone, and she'd begged him not to, her voice breaking on the words. He'd felt a surge of protectiveness then, something he hadn't felt in years, not since his mother had died and left him alone in the world. So he'd done the only thing he could think of. He'd unlocked the school again, led her to the locker room where the heating vents kept the air warm, and told her she could stay until morning. He'd found her a blanket from the supply closet, a thin thing meant for students who got sick, and he'd sat with her for a while, not asking questions, just being there. "I didn't know who you were," Mark said, his voice quiet. "You didn't tell me your name. You just said you needed somewhere safe, and I believed you." Lila's eyes filled with tears again, but she smiled faintly, a ghost of gratitude. "You didn't ask for anything," she said. "You just helped. And when I tried to give you the bracelet, when I told you it was all I had and I wanted you to keep it, you said no. You said you'd hold on to it for me, that I'd need it someday." Mark nodded slowly, the memory crystallizing now, sharp and clear. He'd taken the bracelet from her, studied it in the dim light of the locker room, and recognized it for what it was, something expensive, something that didn't belong in his hands. But she'd insisted, and he'd hidden it in the broken locker, the one no one ever used, and he'd told her where to find it if she came back. Adrian's voice cut through the silence, sharp and demanding. "What did she tell you? What did she say she was running from?" Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting to Lila, who had gone pale, her hands trembling. "She didn't tell me much," Mark said carefully. "She just said she'd seen something she shouldn't have, something that involved her father's company. She said if anyone found out she knew they'd—" He stopped, the rest of the sentence hanging unspoken in the air. Adrian stepped forward, his face inches from Mark's, his voice a low growl. "They'd what? Finish the sentence." Mark met his gaze, refusing to look away despite the fear coiling in his gut. "She said they'd make sure she never talked." Adrian recoiled as though struck, and for a moment the mask of control slipped entirely, revealing a man who looked hollowed out, devastated. He turned to Lila, his voice breaking. "What did you see?" Lila stood, her body trembling, her voice barely audible. "I saw the files, Dad. The ones you keep locked in your private server. I saw what Voss Innovations was doing, the contracts with governments, the surveillance tech you were selling, the data you were harvesting. I saw the people whose lives you ruined for profit." Adrian staggered back, his hand gripping the edge of the desk. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "It was business. It was necessary. The world doesn't work the way you think it does, Lila." But she shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "It was wrong, and you knew it, and I couldn't be part of it anymore." Mark watched the exchange, feeling like an intruder in a moment too raw, too private, but unable to look away. He thought of the bracelet in his hands, of the name engraved inside, and he understood now why Lila had run, why she'd hidden the one thing that connected her to her father's world. And he understood, too, that by helping her, he'd become complicit in a secret that threatened to topple an empire, and that Adrian Voss would do anything to protect what he'd built, even if it meant destroying his own daughter in the process. The air in Adrian Voss's study felt thick, oppressive, as though the weight of the truth Lila had just spoken had compressed the oxygen and left them all struggling to breathe. Adrian stood frozen, his hand still gripping the edge of the desk, his knuckles white with the force of it. His face had drained of color. The mask of control he'd worn so carefully now shattered, revealing a man caught between rage and despair. Mark sat motionless, the bracelet still in his hand, his mind racing to process the enormity of what had been said. Voss Innovations, the empire that had built towers and bought politicians, was founded on surveillance, on data harvested without consent, on technology sold to regimes that used it to crush dissent and control populations. And Lila, 24 years old and terrified, had discovered it and chosen to run rather than become complicit. Mark felt a surge of something he couldn't name, respect, perhaps, or sorrow, for this young woman who had sacrificed everything to escape the stain of her father's ambition. Adrian finally moved, his steps slow and deliberate as he crossed the room to where Lila stood. He didn't touch her, didn't reach out, but his proximity felt like a cage closing around her. "You don't understand what you're saying," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You saw files, yes, you saw contracts, but you don't understand the context, the necessity of what we do. Voss Innovations provides security, Lila. We protect people. We prevent attacks, we stop criminals, we save lives." Lila's laugh was bitter, hollow, a sound that didn't belong in someone so young. "You save lives?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You sell tools that governments use to spy on their own citizens, to track dissidents, to silence journalists. I saw the names, Dad. I saw the countries you're selling to, regimes that torture and disappear people. You're not saving anyone. You're profiting from their suffering." Adrian's hand slammed down on the desk, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. "You think the world is black and white?" he shouted, his composure finally breaking. "You think we can afford to be idealistic when there are threats everywhere, when every day brings new dangers? I built this company to protect people like you, Lila, to give you a future, a legacy, and you threw it away because you couldn't handle the reality of what it takes to survive in this world." Lila didn't flinch, didn't step back. Instead, she met his gaze with a steadiness that belied the trembling of her hands. "I threw it away," she said quietly, "because I couldn't live with myself knowing what you were doing, and I won't let you justify it by pretending it was for me. You built this empire for yourself, Dad, for your ego, for your power, and when I found out the truth, you didn't try to stop. You didn't question whether it was right. You just kept going." Mark watched the exchange, his chest tight, his mind struggling to reconcile the image of the billionaire standing before him with the idea of a man capable of such ruthless ambition. But the truth was undeniable, written in the anguish on Adrian's face. In the way Lila's voice trembled with conviction, even as her body shook with fear. Mark realized that he was no longer just a witness to their conflict. He was a part of it now, bound to them by the bracelet he'd found and the night he'd spent helping Lila escape. And the question pressing down on him, heavy as the silence that filled the room, was what he would do with the knowledge he now possessed. Adrian turned to him then, his gaze sharp, calculating, and Mark saw in those pale eyes a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, bending the world to his will. "You," Adrian said, his voice cold, "are a problem." Mark's breath caught, his body tensing. "I didn't ask to be part of this," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I just found a bracelet and returned it. I didn't know—" "But now you do," Adrian interrupted, his tone icy. "Now you know about the files, about the contracts, about everything my daughter saw, and that makes you a liability." Mark's pulse quickened, fear coiling in his stomach. He glanced at Lila, who looked stricken, her hands reaching out as though to stop her father from saying more. "Dad, don't," she pleaded. "He helped me. He didn't do anything wrong." But Adrian ignored her, stepping closer to Mark, his presence overwhelming. "I could make you disappear," Adrian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have the resources, the connections. No one would ask questions. A janitor who vanished, it wouldn't even make the news." The words hung in the air, a threat delivered with chilling precision, and Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. He'd spent his life invisible, unnoticed, and now that invisibility had become a weapon someone could use against him. But instead of cowering, instead of begging, Mark felt something harden inside him, a resolve he didn't know he had. He stood, meeting Adrian's gaze, his voice quiet but firm. "You could," he said, "but that wouldn't change what Lila knows. It wouldn't erase the files or the truth. It would just make you a murderer on top of everything else." Adrian's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, and for a moment Mark thought he'd gone too far, that Adrian would follow through on his threat. But then Lila stepped between them, her voice breaking through the tension like a blade. "Enough," she said, her tone raw with emotion. "This isn't who you are, Dad, or it shouldn't be." Adrian looked at his daughter, and something in his expression crumbled, the rage giving way to something that looked almost like grief. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hoarse. "Everything I built, it's all I have. If the truth comes out, it's over. The company, my reputation, everything. I'll lose it all." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but her voice didn't waver. "You already lost me," she said, 3 years ago. And you didn't even notice until I came back for the bracelet." The words landed like blows, and Adrian staggered back, sinking into his chair, his head in his hands. The room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, and Mark stood there, holding the bracelet that had started all of this, the sapphire stones glinting in the light. He thought of the photograph Lila had shown him, of the man he'd been that night 3 years ago, exhausted and barely holding on, but still willing to help someone in need. And he thought of the choice now before him, to walk away, to leave Lila and Adrian to their fractured relationship and the empire teetering on the edge of collapse, or to stay, to see this through, to make sure that the truth, whatever it cost, would not be buried again. He looked at Lila, at the young woman who had risked everything to stand against her father's greed, and he made his decision. "I'm not going anywhere," Mark said, his voice steady. "Not until this is finished, not until the truth comes out." Adrian looked up, his face a mask of exhaustion and defeat, and Mark saw in that moment the cracks spreading through the dynasty Adrian had built, the empire beginning to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. and as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, casting long shadows across the room, Mark Ellison, the invisible janitor who had found a bracelet beneath a broken locker, became the man who would help bring a billionaire's empire to its knees. The city, beyond the penthouse windows, began to glow with the pale, tentative light of dawn, the sky shifting from deep indigo to a bruised grey that signaled the approach of a new day. Mark stood by the glass, his reflection ghostly against the view of Chicago sprawling beneath him, and he felt the weight of the night pressing down on his shoulders, the enormity of the choice before him settling in his chest like a stone. Behind him, Adrian Voss sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed, his hands hanging limp at his sides, a man who had spent decades building an empire only to watch it fracture in the span of a single conversation. Lila sat on the couch, her knees pulled to her chest, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze distant, as though she were somewhere far from this room, far from the reckoning that had unfolded here. The silence between them was heavy, fraught with everything unsaid, and Mark knew that the next words spoken would determine the course of all their lives. He turned from the window, his gaze moving between father and daughter, and he thought about the man he'd been 3 years ago, the janitor who had found a girl shivering in the cold and offered her shelter without asking questions. That man had acted on instinct, on a sense of decency that had nothing to do with power or wealth or the complicated web of lies that bound Adrian and Lila together. And now, that same instinct was pulling him forward, demanding that he do what was right, even if it meant standing against a man who could crush him with a single phone call. Mark cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the silence. "There's only one way this ends," he said, his tone firm. "The truth has to come out, not just about the files, not just about what Voss Innovations has been doing, but all of it. The contracts, the governments you've been selling to, the people who've been harmed. It all has to be exposed." Adrian's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with something between fury and desperation. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice ragged. "If the truth comes out, it's not just me who suffers. It's everyone who works for the company, the thousands of employees who depend on Voss Innovations for their livelihoods. It's the investors, the partners, the families who've built their lives around what I created. You'd destroy all of that to satisfy some misguided sense of justice?" Mark met his gaze without flinching. "It's not misguided," he said. "It's the only thing that matters. You can't justify what you've done by pointing to the collateral damage of stopping it. Those people deserve to know the truth. They deserve to decide whether they want to be part of a company built on exploitation and surveillance. And if exposing that truth destroys Voss Innovations, then maybe it deserves to be destroyed." Lila looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but steady, and she nodded, a small, almost imperceptible gesture of agreement. "He's right, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I've spent 3 years running from this, hiding because I was afraid of what would happen if I spoke up. But I can't keep running. And you can't keep pretending that what you've built is worth protecting if it's built on the suffering of others." Adrian's face twisted, his hands clenching into fists, and for a moment Mark thought he would lash out, that the fury simmering beneath his surface would explode. But instead, Adrian's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him, and he looked suddenly old, diminished, a man who had lost something he could never reclaim. "You don't understand," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did it for you, Lila. All of it. I wanted to give you a world where you'd never have to struggle, never have to worry, and this is how you repay me." Lila stood, crossing the room to kneel beside her father's chair, her hand resting on his arm. "You didn't do it for me," she said gently, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it for yourself, because you couldn't stand the idea of being ordinary, of not being powerful, and I love you, Dad, I do. But I can't let that love blind me to what you've done. I can't let it stop me from doing what's right." Adrian looked down at her, his eyes glistening, and for a moment Mark saw the ghost of something softer, something almost human, flicker across his face. But then it was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating expression of a man who had spent his life making impossible decisions and living with the consequences. Adrian pulled away from Lila's touch, standing and moving to the window where Mark had been moments before. "If the truth comes out," he said, his voice flat, "I'll be ruined. Arrested, probably. Voss Innovations will collapse, and Lila—" He turned to look at his daughter, his gaze piercing. "You'll be dragged into it too. The media will tear you apart. They'll paint you as complicit, as someone who knew and did nothing. Your life will never be the same." Lila met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly, and Mark saw in that moment the strength she'd been hiding all along, the resilience that had allowed her to survive 3 years on the run. "I know," she said simply, "but I'd rather live with the consequences of telling the truth than spend the rest of my life hiding from it." Adrian's jaw tightened, and he turned back to the window, his reflection stark against the growing light. The city was waking up, people beginning their days, unaware of the drama unfolding in the penthouse above them, unaware that decisions being made in this room would ripple outward, touching lives they'd never know. Mark stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. "There's a way to do this that protects Lila," he said. "She can go to the authorities, give them the files, testify against the people who were complicit, but she doesn't have to be the only voice. I can corroborate her story. Tell them about the night I helped her, about the bracelet. And if you," he gestured to Adrian, "if you cooperate, if you admit what you've done and help dismantle the systems you built, it might be enough to keep Lila out of the worst of it." Adrian barked a harsh laugh, devoid of humor. "You think I'd sacrifice myself to protect her, after everything she's done to betray me?" Mark shook his head. "It's not about sacrifice," he said. "It's about taking responsibility. You built this empire. You made the choices that led to this moment. And now you have a chance to do the right thing, to show Lila and yourself that you're more than just the sum of your greed and ambition." The room fell silent again, the weight of Mark's words hanging in the air, and Adrian stood motionless, his back to them, his shoulders tense. Minutes passed, the light outside growing brighter, the city coming fully awake, and Mark waited, his heart pounding, unsure what Adrian would choose. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice low and tired. "If I do this," he said, "if I cooperate, what happens to me?" Mark glanced at Lila, who nodded, her eyes filled with cautious hope. "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but it's better than the alternative, and it's the only way to start making things right." Adrian turned slowly, his gaze moving between Mark and Lila, and for the first time since Mark had met him, the billionaire looked uncertain, stripped of the confidence and control that had defined him. "All right," Adrian said finally, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it. I'll cooperate, but I want one thing in return." Lila frowned, her body tensing. "What?" Adrian looked at his daughter, and his expression softened just slightly, a crack in the armor he'd built around himself. "Forgiveness," he said. "Not now, maybe not ever. But someday, I want the chance to earn it." Lila's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, a small, fragile gesture that felt like the beginning of something, not an ending. "Someday," she whispered. "Maybe." Mark felt his chest tighten, the emotion of the moment overwhelming, and he realized that he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled slowly, his body relaxing slightly, and he looked at the bracelet still in his hand, the sapphire stones catching the dawn light. He held it out to Lila, and she took it, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. The sun broke over the horizon, flooding the penthouse with golden light, and Mark Ellison, the invisible janitor, who had found a bracelet beneath a broken locker, felt the weight on his shoulders lift just slightly. He didn't know what would come next, didn't know whether Adrian would keep his word or whether the truth would destroy them all. But he knew that he'd made the right choice, that he'd stood on the side of justice even when it was terrifying, even when it cost him the safety of his anonymity. And as Lila clutched the bracelet to her chest, her father standing silent and broken beside her, Mark understood that some stories don't have clean endings, that some choices leave scars that never fully heal. But they were necessary, these choices, these reckonings. They were the only way forward. And as the city woke beneath them, Mark walked toward the door, leaving the Vosses to face the dawn together, knowing that he'd done all he could, and that the rest was up to them.